Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fitaurus Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fitaurus. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this Saturday we have Rigid Force Alpha, a beautiful homage to classic horizontal shoot 'em ups. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. So Rigid Force Alpha is a title that just released on Steam from Com8 Com1 Games. So it's definitely in the vein of titles like R-Type and Gradius, so you'll definitely see those comparisons really quickly. Under the new game, we have the option to play the main mission, which is what you start with. As you unlock stages, you'll get arcade mode and then beat the game to get boss rush. There's also an introduction which acts as your tutorial. Starting the game itself, we can select our difficulty, easy, medium, or hard. In the game itself, you play the titular ship, the Rigid Force Alpha. Basically trying to free the solar system from what would kind of be like a corrupt AI or a corrupt power source, rather, that's gone on. So we have a basic shot for our fighter, which kind of looks a little bit similar if you've played these kind of games. There's also secondary weapons that we can start to collect certain power-ups for. So there are a total of 3 different shots that we can collect for our ship in addition to the base one that we start out with. The 3 are the blue laser, which we are currently using. There's also a yellow spread shot and a green rebound shot. Between the laser and the rebound, those are the 2 that I like the best, but I'm not sure which one is ultimately the most effective to use. It really depends on the situation. Here's the yellow spread, which I'm not that big of a fan of, but in certain situations it does get the job done. We've also been collecting little force shards throughout the course of the stage that are basically building us what looks very similar to an R-Type style force in front of our ship. In fact, it's even called a force in this game. So there's definitely that for homage. As far as other attacks that we have, so we have the ability to charge up our current weapon and fire a powerful version of it, but that uses energy. So to replenish energy, we collect these energy orbs that the enemies drop. We can either do that by flying the ship into them, or we have also an attract field, which will attract enemy shards from most of the stage, making it very easy to collect the necessary shards to keep our energy full. There's also, if you have the energy for it, a bullet blade, which I will use now, and that is for taking care of bullets close range to the ship, kind of like a defensive wipe, but you do need a lot of energy to be able to use it, and given the range that it affects, I don't feel it's effective enough for its cost. You can also use the force to attack the enemies as well. And like the the R-Type force, one of the things that the force can do is it can cover the front or the back of the ship. You can't necessarily detach it from the ship and have it attack separately, but you can move its position and actually introduce a couple of different firing positions. So here we are against the boss of Stage 1, the defense satellite. So I was mentioning homage. Some of it is like very heavily borrowed homage. So if you've played R-Type 3, you'll recognize this boss, as the fight is very, very similar to the first boss fight from that game. So we have to destroy all the cannons on the exterior. Once the cannons are destroyed, it will open up its core. We just use a charge shot, and before you know it, bam, Stage 1 is done. So being able to go and move your force from the front to the back is useful because it can introduce several different firing options for dealing with enemies, both behind you or even in front of you, as if you move it to the first position back, you have a greater spread for your weapon, like so. And especially early on in the stage when you're dealing with weaker, smaller enemies, it does a great job of making short work of them, as you have great coverage on the screen. We can select a total of 4 force shards to make a full force. So here we have to worry about enemies coming from behind. as I mentioned, we can move the force to cover ourselves well from behind as well. The force shards also will deal damage to enemies, whether it just be directly in front of you when it's positioned that way, or when it's in this wing formation facing either direction. And that's the basics that we have for Rigid Force Alpha. The other two missile types, there's one called the... here's the rebound, so I can show that off. The rebound shot will, of course, bounce off walls, and it can be very effective, especially in a stage like this where you have short corridors. So there are two other missile types that I haven't talked about yet. One is called the Seeker, where it will seek out enemies on the same plane, so basically a parallel to it, and it'll fire above and below the ship. So it can be effective in certain situations, but I feel that the homing is more effective overall. But the one that I like the best is the bomb, which kind of just is almost like just a dumb drop straight out of the ship below you, but those can be very effective at dealing a lot of damage quickly, so I like that kind of shot in most shoot-em-ups, although some aren't as good. So the game employs a hit system where your ship can take multiple hits before you lose a life. One thing I haven't been able to figure out is if there's an indicator at all for how many hits you've taken or how many hits you can still take. So that's a little bit of a frustration on my part. There's also... you are collecting lives throughout the course of it, but it's one of those where when you get to 0, that's game over. Not when you have 0 lives left, that's your final life. So that's something to keep in mind. The other two modes, the arcade mode, you just play through the stage without fighting the boss, and in Boss Rush, you'll fight against the game's 6 bosses, but you'll have some recharge stages in between, so you can get your power back up, which is something of a problem if you happen to continue against a boss in the normal game. You don't have that. So here's the core plasmid. Not necessarily the stage's boss, more of a sub-boss. Took a hit there, so I'll have to be a little careful. Well, most enemies are good about giving you opportunities to collect energy orbs throughout the course of the boss fight, so you can use that energy orb against them. Or rather, so you can use that energy charge against the final boss. So we've completed stage 2, and now we move on to the boss of stage 2. And that's basically what we have here for Rigid Force Alpha. The game is a total of 6 stages long, so it's about the right length, I feel, for an arcade shoot-'em-up. So this boss is yet another one that, if you've played enough shooters, might look just a little familiar. As far as minus flavors are concerned, so not knowing how many hits you can take before you die is, I feel, a really big problem. Right now I'm playing with the dialogue and the cutscenes turned off. Normally those are there, and your ship AI will call out when you've taken damage, but it doesn't seem like that's a good indicator for how much damage you've taken. And this is like kind of a more minor complaint coming from a gameplay standpoint, but I just don't feel like for the effort you go to collect the energy for the charged shots, that the charged shots are effective enough in certain situations. Sometimes they work great, but other times it's like, is that really all I've got with that? And then this is more of a minus flavor of where the game is at right now. Depending on when you're looking into it, it might not be an issue, but there were some minor I did have some minor not necessarily minor, I did have some issues getting my controller to work with the game itself. Here's the bomb that I was talking about. It's a really powerful straight draw, which can work really well against some enemies. But as far as plus flavors are concerned, it's basically just the presentation, the whole package. I love the music. I love the graphics in the game itself. They're beautiful 3D rendered. So it goes and takes that like 2D look and recreates it beautifully with a nice 3D flair. And another part that I really like about the game as well is the soundtrack. Then we've got a whole bunch of small little attention to detail points that I also really love. Like when your ship accelerates, you get massive jet trails behind you. When you're going backwards, then those jet trails almost completely disappear. Just small little touches like that are some things I just look forward to and love seeing in not just shoot 'em ups, really any video game. And then another big plus flavor for me was the boss rush. I had a huge amount of fun playing through the boss rush, and I feel it's a great way to test yourself if you're a fan of the game. You can just work on trying to lower your time and climb that admittedly relatively small leaderboard, as at this point in time there are only 6 times recorded on the easy boss fight, boss rush leaderboard. So definitely, if you look at picking up this game, stick with it until you unlock boss rush and then get your time on there. So if you're a fan of R-Type and Gradius in particular, this is a title that I can definitely recommend hands down. It goes and takes the formula that's present in those games and just gives it almost basically just a new coat of paint, and it just feels good. So this is one that I can heartily recommend, and there you have it. Rigid Force Alpha served up for your enjoyment. Well, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for coming out and joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.